Every June, millions of people worldwide celebrate Pride with rainbow flags and parades. But how many actually know that these celebrations trace directly back to a violent police raid at a small New York bar called the Stonewall Inn? How many understand what life was really like for LGBTQ plus people before that watershed moment? Today, I challenge you to look beyond the sanitized, commercialized version of Pride and understand the raw, revolutionary roots of this movement. By the end of this video, you'll see why Stonewall wasn't just a riot. It was a necessary uprising against a system designed to erase LGBTQ plus people from existence, and how its legacy continues to impact millions today. Have you ever wondered what would happen if simply being yourself could get you arrested, fired from your job, or committed to a mental institution? This was the reality for LGBTQ plus people before Stonewall. In pre-Stonewall America, homosexuality wasn't just stigmatized, it was criminalized in almost every state, with laws specifically targeting same-sex activities. The medical establishment was complicit in this system of oppression. The American Psychiatric Association officially classified homosexuality as a mental disorder until 1974. This wasn't just a matter of labeling, it provided scientific justification for horrific treatments. Doctors subjected LGBTQ+ individuals to electroshock therapy in attempts to cure them, a practice that seems almost medieval by today's standards. New York City might have had a reputation for being culturally progressive, but don't be fooled. The city maintained particularly harsh anti-gay laws. People could be arrested simply for not wearing what police considered gender-appropriate clothing. Imagine being thrown in jail because your outfit didn't match society's expectations of how your gender should dress. The 1950s brought additional dangers with the Lavender Scare, a lesser-known companion to McCarthy's Red Scare. During this Cold War panic, thousands of gay government employees were systematically fired after being labeled security risks. The twisted logic claimed that homosexuals could be blackmailed by Soviet agents because of their deviant lifestyle. These baseless firings destroyed countless careers and lives, all under the guise of national security. The legal system created impossible situations for LGBTQ+ individuals seeking community. Serving alcoholic beverages to known homosexuals was explicitly illegal. This made any gathering space vulnerable to police raids, which often ended with public humiliation and newspaper exposure. Imagine having your name published in the local paper after a bar raid, leading to losing your job, your housing, and perhaps even your family connections. With legitimate businesses refusing to serve LGBTQ+ people, an unlikely alliance formed out of necessity. The mafia stepped in to fill this void, operating underground gay bars like the Stonewall Inn. Let's be clear. This wasn't out of acceptance or allyship. The mob saw profit potential in catering to a desperate community with nowhere else to go. These mafia-run establishments were far from ideal sanctuaries. They charged inflated prices for watered-down drinks in often unsanitary conditions. Patrons had to use filthy bathrooms, deal with unreliable water supplies, and risk their health just to have a space where they could briefly be themselves. The mob knew these customers had no alternatives. They couldn't complain to authorities about poor service or health violations without risking arrest themselves. The constant threat of raids meant LGBTQ+ individuals had no political power to advocate for better treatment. Police didn't need justification to raid these establishments. Being gay was reason enough. This created a climate of perpetual fear where blackmail became a constant concern. Some officers would extort protection money from bar owners or patrons, threatening exposure if they didn't pay up. Despite living under this oppressive system, LGBTQ plus people demonstrated remarkable resilience. They created intricate communities in the shadows of society. To identify each other safely in a world that criminalized their existence, they developed coded language, specific clothing styles that served as subtle signals, and knowledge of secret meeting places. This underground network allowed people to find love, friendship, and support when mainstream society offered only rejection. Think about the psychological toll of living in constant fear. Every interaction carried risk. Every new acquaintance might be an undercover officer. Every phone call could be monitored. Every letter might be intercepted. Yet within this atmosphere of terror, LGBTQ plus individuals still found ways to create meaningful connections and build communities that sustained them. When that atmosphere of terror finally reached its breaking point, history was made by those who had been pushed furthest to the margins. While we often hear sanitized versions about Stonewall that credit privileged gay men, the real revolution began with trans women, drag queens, and people of color, those who had absolutely nothing left to lose and became the architects of a movement that would transform American society forever. The Stonewall Inn stood apart from other underground establishments of its time. Despite its flaws, it provided something precious, a space where same-sex couples could actually dance together and where the most marginalized found rare acceptance. The bar welcomed drag queens, transgender people, homeless youth, and people of color, individuals often rejected even within their own LGBTQ plus circles. That acceptance made what happened next all the more significant. At precisely 1:15 a.m. on June 28, 1969, police officers burst into the bar for what should have been just another routine raid. But something was different this time. When officers began ordering patrons into paddy wagons, particularly targeting transgender women and drag queens for gender-inappropriate clothing, the unexpected happened. They refused. This simple act of defiance sparked something extraordinary. As police aggression escalated inside, curious bystanders gathered outside the bar. But they didn't remain passive observers for long. Witnessing the brutal treatment of Stonewall patrons transformed these onlookers into outraged protesters. What began as scattered resistance crystallized into collective action. The figures who catalyzed this resistance have often been erased from mainstream retellings. Marsha P. Johnson, a black transgender woman, reportedly threw what became known as the shot glass heard around the world while shouting, "I got my civil rights." This single act helped ignite the uprising. When people asked what the P in her name stood for, she famously replied, "Pay it no mind," a perfect encapsulation of her revolutionary spirit. Equally important was Sylvia Rivera, a trans Latina activist who wasn't about to miss what she instantly recognized as a pivotal moment. As she joined the resistance, she declared, "I'm not missing a moment of this. It's the revolution." Meanwhile, Stormé DeLarverie, a biracial lesbian drag performer, is believed to have thrown the first punch after being clubbed by police, turning to the crowd and urging them to take action. What's often lost in simplified accounts is that Stonewall wasn't just one night of protest, it was 6 days of sustained resistance. From June 28th to July 3rd, the streets of Greenwich Village echoed with chants of "Gay Power" and "Liberate Christopher Street" as hundreds of protesters gathered each night. The demonstrations grew increasingly strategic and forceful. The community's response wasn't polite or peaceful. It couldn't be after decades of systematic abuse. Protesters uprooted parking meters and used them as battering rams against police barricades. They threw bottles, coins, and bricks at officers who had retreated inside the bar. Some even fashioned makeshift firebombs. When riot police arrived in tactical gear, they found themselves facing a community that had finally decided collective resistance was the only path forward. The brutality of the response reflected years of accumulated rage. Police, initially overwhelmed, barricaded themselves inside the Stonewall Inn as the crowd grew increasingly militant outside. This wasn't just people letting off steam. This was a desperate fight for dignity against a system designed to erase their existence. What made Stonewall fundamentally different from previous raids was who led the charge. It wasn't the more privileged, respectable members of the gay community who ignited this revolution. It was those who existed at society's most vulnerable intersections, those with the least institutional power, the least social protection, and consequently, the least to lose by fighting back, became the catalyst for change that would benefit all. The legacy of Stonewall stretches far beyond those 6 days in 1969. What began as a desperate stand against oppression has transformed into a global movement, with pride celebrations spanning continents and the Stonewall Inn itself now standing as a national monument. But we shouldn't mistake today's celebrations for complete victory. Despite significant progress, the fight continues. In 2023, 69 countries still criminalize same-sex relationships. Transgender individuals and LGBTQ+ people of color face disproportionate discrimination and violence, even in nations with legal protections. Their experiences echo what those brave souls at Stonewall understood instinctively, that meaningful change requires more than patience or polite requests. The most powerful lesson from Stonewall is this: rights are never simply granted from above. They must be demanded, fought for, and defended by those willing to stand firm against injustice. The rainbow flags we see today were earned through courage that refused to bend even when victory seemed impossible.